Hello friends and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to learn all about MERN stack and build a full application with authentication where users can register, log in and log out and post blog posts. So let's have a quick introduction to MERN stack first. So MERN consists of 4 tools, and that is MongoDB, Express.JS, React.js and Node. Together they spell MERN. And MongoDB is our database, which is a document-based database, and it stores data in key value pairs like a JSON object. And it's also referred to a non-SQL or non-relational database. So typically we have our database and then a collection, which is similar to tables in a relational database. Then within the collections, we have documents, which is similar to the rows inside the table of a relational database. So we will use MongoDB as our database. For the backend, we have Node.js and Express.js. So Node is a JavaScript server-side scripting language that allows us to run our code without the need of a client or a web browser. And Express is a framework built on Node.js that can help us to build our REST API quite easily. For the front end, we are going to use React, and React is a front-end JavaScript library that can help us to build SPAs and component-based user interfaces. And for the styles, we will use Tailwind CSS in this video, but of course you are welcome to use any CSS framework or even plain CSS if you wanted to. We also need a package manager because we are going to use a few packages to help us develop our app. And we will use NPM as the recommended feature for Node.js, and it will be installed alongside with Node.js when you install it for the first time. And some of the packages that we will use for our project are these. The first one is Mongoose, that is a JavaScript object-oriented programming library that can create a connection between MongoDB and Node.js. And then we will use Node, that is going to automatically restart our application. Then we will use JsonWebTokens. Since we are going to have authentication, we need to have some sort of a signature to authorize users to do certain tasks. Then to hash users' passwords, we want to use BcryptJS. So we don't want to save the plain text passwords in our database. We want to hash them before saving them. And a few other packages and programs that we will use in this video. So let's get started by setting up our project. All right, so I created a folder on my desktop called it MERN 2024, and I opened it in VS Code. So the first thing I'm going to do here is to create a folder and call it Backend. And we want to initialize our Node application inside this folder. So let's cd Backend. And first you need to check if you have Node installed, and you can do that by typing node-v. If that gave you a version number, that means it's installed and good to go. If not, you can download and install it from nodejs.org. Now, when you install Node, you can also run npm commands, which is the default package manager for Node. And to initialize our app, we can use the npm init command, and this will ask us a bunch of questions like package name, version, description, and so on. And we can just press enter on all of those, and it will create a package.json for us. This file contains some information about our app, the scripts that our app is going to use, and the dependencies that we will install in a moment. You can also create this file by saying npm init-y, which will set the default value for all of these information. Now, the next thing I want to do is to install all the packages we need for our project so we don't have to come back and install them one by one throughout the video. To install packages, we can use npm install, or for short, we can just say npm I, and then name those packages one by one. So Express is one of them, and Mongoose for our database connection. We need .env that is going to help us to read environment variables. We need BcryptJS, we need JsonWebToken, we need NodeMon, and I'm going to install MongoDB. We don't actually need this, but I just want to show you how you can use MongoDB to connect to database instead of Mongoose. I'm going to press enter on this, and this will install all those packages for me. All right, so when that's done, we will have a dependency object in our package.json. So I'm not going to close this because I still want to do some changes here. So I will come back here later. Let's create our first file in the backend folder. So this is going to be a JavaScript file. So server.js. You can name it whatever you want, but server is just a convention. So this is a JavaScript file, and we can run any code. Let's say log, for example, hello. Now, if I want to run this code, I have to come back to the terminal and just type node and then the name of the document, server.js, and this will execute the code for me. But the problem is, if I want to run it again, then I have to run that command again. So every time there is a change or every time I want to execute my code, I have to come down here and run this command. And this is where nodemon comes in. Instead of saying node server, we can say npx nodemon, then the name of the document, server.js. When we press enter, nodemon is going to watch this file. So if there is a change and save it, it's going to rerun it and we get the output. So I'm going to break this process by pressing Ctrl C and go back to package.json and create a script for that nodemon command. So I'm going to get rid of this test and call this server and set it to nodemon, then the name of the document, server.js for me. Now, instead of saying npx nodemon, I can say npm run server. So this will do the same thing. Now in Node.js, we have to create our server manually in order to listen to requests or respond with something. Unlike PHP, for example, where you just start your server using third-party programs like XAMPP. So in order to create our server in Node.js, we have to import a module from Node. And this is a built-in module, so we don't need to install it. So this module is called HTTP, and I'm going to use the require HTTP statement so we can use it. So this is fine and it will work, but I want to use the new import statement. And in order to use the import statement in Node.js, we have to do a bit of setup. Okay, so if I comment this out and save it, we get a warning that says, in order to load an ES module, we need to set the type to module in our package.json. So let's just copy this, and in the package.json, we are just going to paste it. So this would solve the problem. Now, if I go back to the terminal, you can see it's all good. So throughout this video, we will use the ES import statement. So let's grab that HTTP object and use the create server method to create our server. This method takes a callback function, and in that callback function, we can accept request and response, so we can handle requests and responses. So I will explain in a moment what they are or how they work. Now, when we create our server, we actually have to specify to listen to a certain port and host. So we can use the listen method and specify the port, let's say 4000, and then the second argument, which is the host name. So I want to say localhost, and we are good to go. Now let's save this document and go to a web browser and open a new tab and go to localhost port 4000. You notice that the browser is trying to load something, but it can't. So when we are going to a URL, we are requesting something that is handled by this request object. But when the browser is waiting for something, we need to respond using the response object. So let's say I want to respond with some text. I can use the response object and write to it. Using the write method, I want to say hello user. Let's save it, go back to the browser and refresh the page. You can see we still don't get the response because with Node create server method, we actually have to say that we are done with sending the responses using the end method. Now, if we save it and go back here and press enter on the URL, we get hello user. So let's inspect this site and see what we have. We have a body tag and a pre tag by default. Also, if we go to the network tab and refresh the site, and down here we have localhost. In our headers, we have some information like the request URL, which was this, and then the path was this /, which is the home page. And then request method was get. So these are the HTTP methods like get, post, put, patch, and a bunch of others. Then we have our status code, which is again HTTP status codes like 200, which is okay, 404, which is page not found, and a bunch of other information. So let's see how we can use this information in our application. So I want to check the request URL so I can just send that as a response. So I want to say, instead of this text, send a request URL. So let's save this one, go back to the browser and refresh this one. We get the / because that path or URL is actually just whatever is after the domain. If we go to / about, for example, we get that string. Now let's say we want to set our headers manually. So before we write a response, we can write our headers using write head method, and this takes a few arguments. The first one is the status code. I pulled up this website that is 10 most common HTTP status codes, and if you scroll down, we have a nice information here. So for example, we have 200, it's okay. 301, which is permanent redirect. or 400, a bad request. Let's use 400. So I want to set this to 400, and then the second argument is going to be the status message. I want to say bad request. And then the third argument is the object with the actual headers that we want to set. Let's say I want to set the content type to text HTML. So let's save this one, go back to the browser and refresh our site. Let's see what happens. So you notice, first of all, we get some styles because now it recognizes the HTML. So you can see we get some default styles. Also in our network tab, we get our status code set to 400 bad request. And if you scroll down a bit, we have our content type set to text HTML. So we could also check for the method and send a response if the method is different. So let's make an if statement here and check if the request method is post, then we want to respond with something different. We want to write a response again and say, maybe say post request. Now we can't really test this out because in the browser we don't have any form with post method. So we are kind of limited using the browser, but we can use a program for that, and that is Postman. So we are going to use Postman for our API development. And this is a nice interface where we can just include the endpoint and send the request, but we can change the request method easily. And I've already downloaded and installed Postman on my machine. So when you open Postman, you would see a overview page, and I believe you have to sign in first. But what we need here is a window. So you might see this window open already for you when you open it for the first time, but if it's not, you can just press on this plus icon. But you can see we have a URL section and then the HTTP method, and then we can send the request. So up here is our request section. So whatever is up here is related to the request, and down here is our response section. So when we send a response, it will show up down here. So instead of using the browser, in here, I'm going to go to localhost port 4000. And when you press send and the method is still get, we should get that / because that's what we said we want to respond with. Let's see if we can get this message post request. So we need to change the method to post, and the URL is the same. So let's press send. We get our post request text inside the body of our response. And that's basically how we can create a server and listen to requests and respond with something using plain Node.js. So I don't want to get into too much detail for Node. Maybe later on in future we will have a dedicated course for Node.js. But now we are going to use Express.js. So I'm going to get rid of all of this code and use Express. But don't worry about me deleting the code. Later on I will include a notes file with all these code within it, so you can use it as a reference. So let's start with Express.js. All right, let's import Express from Express module. And the first step is to initialize our app. So I'm going to create an app variable and set it to Express and then invoke that function. This is the same as saying create server. Then we have to tell our app to listen to a certain port. So again, using the listen method, we can say listen to a port, let's say 4000, and the host name, let's say localhost. And we can also pass a callback function here. So I want to log something to the console to make sure everything is working. So for example, listening to port 4000. So if I save this one now, we get that log. That means our server is created and we are listening to port 4000. Now, let's see how we can listen to requests using Express.js. And I'm going to go to Express documentation for a moment. So if you go to getting started and basic routing, we will see this nice structure here that they explain how we can do that, how we can listen to requests. So we have our app instance, then we have a method. Now this method is an HTTP request method. So for example, it's get, post, put, patch, or whatever. Then that method takes two arguments. The first one is the path. For example, if it's our homepage, it's just a /. If it's about page, then it's of course / about. Then the second argument, which is our handler, that is going to take the request and response and handle them. So let's create our first route using Express. So back to the project. Under the app variable, I'm going to grab the app and then use the get method and say listen to the home page or / and then use the callback function, accept request and response, and then respond with something. So instead of saying response write like Node.js, we can use response send. In here, we can just pass text or HTML if we wanted to, and I just want to say hello user. Now, if I save this one, go to Postman and send a get request to this endpoint. Press send, we get hello user. But you notice we get our status code set to 100, and that's okay. The headers, if we check the headers, we get our content type set to text HTML by default, and we didn't also have to end the response. So Express is handling most of the work for us behind the scenes, and we don't have to do many things manually. So that's the simplest response in Express.js. Let's say we want to set the status code manually, so we can just chain another method to the response object, and that is status. So this function or method takes a number that is the HTTP status code number. So 404, for example, which is not found. So if we send a request again in Postman, we get 404 up here. Now, if you worked with any API before, you know most of the time we send and receive JSON. So we don't use plain text, of course. So if we want to send JSON in our application, we can use the JSON method and send an object. I'm going to have a message as a key, and then the actual value would be hello user. Now let's also set the code to 200, which is successful. Now let's save it, go back to Postman, send a request. You can see we get an object where the message is the key and the hello user is the value, but also our headers is set to application JSON automatically. So Express is doing most of the work for us behind the scenes. So that's a simple GET request. Let's have an example for a POST request. So I'm just going to copy paste this one and change get to post. Now this time, instead of saying hello user, I just want to say post request. So let's save this one, go back here and put this back to the body and change this to post method. And the endpoint is the same. Just going to press send. We get post request. So that is basic routing in Express. Now, so far, we've been just responding with something and we are not getting anything from the user. Let's say we have a form and the user registers and we want to grab the username password, or they make a post. We want to get the title or the body. We would use the request body to receive data. As you see in Postman, we send the data using the response body. So the actual data is inside the body of a request or a response. And in the request section, we also have a body. And if I try to send some raw text, so I want to change this to raw and text and just add some text here, press send. We don't get anything because we are not handling the request body yet. For example, we could just say console.log request body. Let's see what we get. So if I send a request again here, post method, same URL, and go back to the project, you can see we get undefined. That's because even though we have something in the body, but we have to tell our app to listen for requests, or we are expecting something in the request body. In this case, for example, we want to accept JSON, and we can do that using another method on the app instance, and that is the use method. So this use method is a way to tell our app to use certain things, and it accepts a middleware. So we don't want to get into too much detail regarding middlewares, but if we go to Express documentation, under guide and using middleware, there are some explanation here that tells us what these middlewares do. But I like to think of middlewares as checkpoints between a client and the server. So for example, when we request a website, request a web page, the middleware comes in the middle and says, okay, is this request something that I want to handle, something that I can handle? Then it's going to respond with it and then end the response, or go to the next one if it is specified to go to the next one. So for our project, we would create our own middleware later on, and that would be easier to understand how they work. But again, think of them as checkpoints. So this get method, for example, is a middleware. When we request the homepage, this one checks if the method is get and the URL is homepage, then it's going to respond with this message and then stop. So it will not go to the next one. But if it doesn't, then go to the next one. Anyway, the middleware we want to use is a built-in middleware down here, and that is Express.JS. So we want to tell Express we are expecting JSON, and this checkpoint or middleware only parses JSON and only looks at the request where the content type is set to JSON. So let's use this in our application. So we want to say express.json inside this use method. And this is a function, so we need to invoke it. Now, if I save this one, go back to Postman, we are sending text in the body of our request, right? So let's press send. Go back to the application. You can see we get an empty object. So we don't get undefined anymore. We get empty object, and that's because this is text and it's not JSON. We said if the header is JSON, then parse it in. And if we check the headers on the request section, you can see it is set to text plain. But if we change this to JSON and check the headers, You can see now it's application JSON. That means it's going to parse it, and we need to actually send a JSON. So let's create a JSON object, and I want to create a title key, and the value is going to be post1. So for example, this is a blog post. So press send and go back to the project. We get an object where the key is title and the value is that post1. So now you can see we are able to grab data out of the request body and then use it in our program. Now, of course, we want to save this into a database. So the next step is to create our routes in the different files, because I don't want to have everything here. It's going to become crowded and difficult to maintain. So what I'm going to do in the backend folder, create a new folder and call it routes. So inside the routes folder, I will have a file and I'm going to call it posts routes. Basically, what I want to do here, have these routes inside that file. So we can cut these and paste them here. Now the problem is the app instance doesn't exist here, and we don't want to create another instance, but what we can use is another object from Express. So let's import Express first. This time we want to create a router. Express has this router object that we can use it and tell our app that we are going to use this router. So notice the capital R, and we need to invoke it. So instead of using the app instance, we can use the router. And of course, since we are going to use it in our server document, we need to export it first. So let's say export, and you can either export it as default or you can export it with aliases. So let's say I want to export it with an alias. So I want to say router as post routes. So I do this because we will have users route later and I don't want them to have the same name. So let's save this one, go back to server, and let's import it. Import posts routes from that file. Now, since we are using the new ES6 module import statement, we need to include the JS extension. Otherwise, Node is not going to find this module. Now we need to tell our app to use those routes. So again, we can use that use method. We can also pass a prefix for our routes. So right now we are just going to the domain and then a /. Now I want to go, for example, to /API/posts. So this is just a convention. So we go to localhost port 4000 /API/posts. And later on, we will have API users. So this will be the prefix, and then this is the path. So if this was, for example, about, then it would be API posts about. All right, so that's the first argument. And as a second argument, we can pass that posts routes. All right, so that's it. So let's save it, save this document too, and let's go back to Postman. Now we want to go to API/posts, and if I press enter here, the method is post. We get post request because that's what we specified here. For the get method, I said I want to go to /about. So let's add /about and change the method to get and press send. We get hello user. So you can see it works the same way, but now our files are organized and our server document or file is nice and clean. So before we get any step further, I want to set up the database so we can communicate with the database and write to our database using our routes. So let's start with setting up our MongoDB. All right, now to start, we need to go to MongoDB website, and there are a couple of ways to set up our MongoDB database. The first one is to set it up locally using the community edition, which is free. The second one using Atlas, which is a cloud-based database, and it's also free. We can set it up. But for this video, we are going to use a local database, and then later on, I will make a short video on how to set up Atlas for your project. So if you are on Windows, you want to go to products and then download this community edition. So on this page, you need to select the package and then your platform. So if you are on Windows, this should be Windows automatically. For the Mac users, I will have another page that I'll show you in a second. Now, the next step is go to the tools and then install MongoDB shell. So this is quite straightforward. You just have to download and install it for your machine. And then also what we are going to use to communicate with our database is MongoDB Compass, which is an interface that we can use. So we don't have to use the terminal. We don't have to use the CLI. So this part is the same for Mac users or Windows users. You just have to choose your platform here and press download. Now to install MongoDB itself for Mac users, go to this link, which is in the description, and then just scroll down, you should see this part that says installing MongoDB using brew. So you need to make sure that you have Xcode command line and brew installed on your machine. Then you can run these commands and install MongoDB. So after you installed it using these 3 commands, you just have to start the service using brew service start MongoDB, and you should be good to go. So I've already installed MongoDB Compass, which is the GUI or interface program, and when you open it for the first time, you should see something like this. So a window that says a new connection with a string in it and just a sidebar. All we have to do here, press connect, and we should see some local default databases and just a plus sign here that allows us to create a new database. So if I press on this one, we need to give our database a name. So I want to call it demo_db and a collection name. So this is again like a table in a relational database, and we need to have at least one collection, one table. So I just want to call it posts because we will have posts, and press create data. On the sidebar now, you can see we have our database and the collection, and up here also we say we have our demodb.posts. So let's insert a data or a document and see how it looks like. So I'm going to get rid of this boilerplate and include the curly brackets because this is similar to JSON, and then have a title, for example, for the key, and the value, let's say post1. So of course we could add more properties here, but I just want to insert this data and see what we get. So press insert, we get our title post1, but we also get an ID. So MongoDB generates the ID for us automatically, and they are not just a number, they are a specific type of object ID. So we don't have to worry about generating our ID ourselves. When we get to our code, we will see how we can actually use Mongoose to create a schema, which is kind of like a pattern for our database, and then a model, and then insert data using that model. You can also change the look on the compass. So if you just press on these buttons here, you can change the look. So if you are coming from a relational database, you might prefer a table look, and that is a table with column and rows. All right, and now let's see how we can connect to our database from our Node application. So let's go back to the project. So I'm going to close these routes for now, and we will come back to that later. In our server document, server.js, I want to use MongoDB first and show you how we can connect using MongoDB, which is quite easy, and then Mongoose. So let's import Mongo client from MongoDB. So this is a class from MongoDB, and we can use it to connect to our database. So let's use that Mongo client, and there is a connect method on this, which takes the URI, which is a string. Now remember, when we connected to our database, it gave us a string. That's the one we want. So if we click on this 3 dots, and then we have this copy connection string. We just have to press on that and then paste it here as a string. And that's it. That's all we have to do to connect to our database. Now this connect method returns a promise. So we can chain the then method from JavaScript and say what's going to happen when we are connected successfully. So for example, let's just console.log connected to DB successfully. Now let's also catch the errors if there are any. So we want to chain a catch block and just say if there is any error, we want to log the error. Let's save this code and see what we get. So you can see in our console, we get connected to DB successfully. That's all we have to do to connect to MongoDB. Now, when it comes to the cloud-based database, which is Atlas, it is exactly the same process. The only difference is this Mongo URI string. With Atlas, you would have more information on your string. For now, we are working just with local. Now, let's do the same thing with Mongoose, which is almost exactly the same. So instead of importing MongoDB here, I'm going to import Mongoose from Mongoose package. Now, instead of saying Mongo client, which it doesn't exist anymore, I'm just going to say Mongoose. The rest is exactly the same. So if I save this one, again, we get connected to DB successfully. Now we need to ask ourselves, what's going to happen when we connect to our database? Basically, we don't want to do anything if the database connection is not successful. So we don't want to start listening to requests if there is no database. So what we can do, just move this statement up here and listen to requests if the connection is successfully done. So if I save this one, we get the same thing, but if there is an error, we are not going to listen to port 4000. So if I change this port, for example, to something that doesn't exist and save it, you can see we get an error and we don't get this listening to port 4000. And the error we get, of course, is unable to parse localhost these numbers. So that is how we can connect to our database. The next step is to create a model or a schema using Mongoose so we can write to our database. All right, so if we go to Mongoose documentation and go to the quick start, and I'm going to zoom in here, and they show us how we can do it. So we need to import it. Then we can create a function to connect, or we can just connect it the way we did. And in order to write to our database, we need a schema. So we can use Mongoose schema to create a new schema and then use that to create our model. And then using that model, we can write to our database. So using Mongoose, we can follow the object-oriented programming way. And if you're not familiar with the schema, think of it as pattern for our database. For example, if you watch my PHP videos, I set up a MySQL database using PHP-MyAdmin. And in PHP-MyAdmin, we need to specify the type and some properties for each column. For example, the name is going to be a string. It needs to be required, or it needs to be unique, and things like that. So let's create our own schema for our blog posts. So inside our backend folder, I'm going to create another folder and call it models. Inside that folder, I will create a file and call it post model with a capital P with a JS extension. So first we need to import Mongoose. So we want to say Mongoose from Mongoose package. Then we can create a post schema and set it to a new Mongoose schema. So this is a class, that's why we use the new keyword. Now this takes the pattern that we want for our collection. For example, I want to have a title field for my posts, and the type of this title field will be a string, and I want to also make sure it is filled in, so it cannot be empty, so I can set the required to true. So we can set other criteria here. For example, we can say max character or min characters, or for example, we want it to be unique, so we can just say unique and set it to true. But for now, this is what we want. Now, when we get to our user, we would have more validations. So I'm going to copy this, paste it down here, change this to body. So we will also have a body for our post, which would be the type string, and it's going to be required. We also want the date. So we want to have a date for our users' posts. We could create a date property for ourselves manually and just set it up the way we want, but we could also use the default timestamp on Mongoose, and that is by providing a second argument in these parentheses, and that is going to be an object. So in this object, we want to set the timestamps to true. This will create a created at and an updated at property for our model. So that's our schema. Now we need to turn this into a model using Mongoose again. So I'm going to create another variable here and call it post and set this to Mongoose, and then use the model function that takes the name for our model. So I'm going to call it post with a capital P. Then the schema, in this case, post schema. So Mongoose will create a collection in our database using the plural version of this name. So if we say post, we will have a posts collection. If we say user, we will have users, and so on. And also this name will be used when we want to reference one collection within another, and we will do that when we get to the users. But for now, this is what we want. Now all I want to do, I just want to export this post, and since it's a unique name, I'm just going to use the default. All right, so that's it. So that is our post model, and we want to use this now to write to our database. So basically we are saying this post model is going to accept a title and a body as an object, of course. So let's go to our posts routes. This is where we are going to create and read and update the posts. I'm going to get rid of this get method, and I want to start by creating a post. So we want to go to the home page of our posts API, and remember we said it's going to be /API/posts. So home page, and the method we want it to be post because we want to listen for incoming requests, and we want to grab the data out of the request body. So let's try this once again. So let's go back to Postman, and we need to go to API/posts, change the method to post. And for the body of our request, we want to have a title and a body. So I'm going to include the body and set it to new post body, for example, and send the request. So back in our project, you can see we have an object with title and body. So let's save this into a variable instead of just console.log. So we can use const and destructure that, say we are expecting a title and a body, right? And set it to request body. We can easily just log those if they exist. So let's go back here, send the request again, and we get post one new post body. Now, before we write into the database, normally we want to do some validation, some simple validation. But here I just want to test and see if things work. So I just want to directly write to the database because I know I have data. When we are communicating with database, all the methods and all the communication between our server and the database is going to be asynchronous. So we need to wait for database communications. So we can turn this function to async, and then instead of this log, I'm going to say await post. Now we need to import this from post model, and VS Code is going to auto import that for me. Now remember, we need to include that JS extension, otherwise it's going to give us an error. So in this post method, which is part of Mongoose, we have a bunch of methods that are related to our MongoDB. If we go back to the documentation and go to our models, for example, and you can find these all over the documentation, but you can see we have all these methods. For example, tank, it's a model, delete one, and you can see they use the await keyword because they are all asynchronous. We have create, we have delete, and a bunch of other ones. So we're going to use some of these in our application, but the one we want to use here is create, because we want to create a new document. Now this method takes the object this posts expect. Remember, in our model we said we need a title and a body, so I can just pass this one instead of this object. Now let's save this one and go back to Postman and send a request. So we have the title, the body, and press send. Let's see what happens. So we get message here, post request, and we should have data in our database. So let's go to Compass and refresh our database here. You can see we don't have anything, but let's refresh. The database is here. Now you see we have a test database. So Mongoose created a test database with the collection posts, and within that post collection is our document. This is not what we want, of course. We want this data to go inside this table in this database. So I'm going to delete this, and we need to say test and drop the database. Now back in our project, in the server.js, where we have our connection string, there are two ways to specify the database. So by default, Mongoose will create a test database for us and save the data within that database. But we want our own specific database. We can either pass this string, so / demo underscore DB. So that means this database. So if I send a request in Postman and go back to Compass and refresh this database, you can see now we have this post 1 with the new post body and the created at and then the updated at. And if I just, maybe this design looks better. So you can see we have an ID and title, body, and other properties that is just auto-generated by MongoDB. So that's one way, using the string, but I personally think using an options is cleaner. So we can provide an options object here as a second argument for connect method, and then specify the DB name and then pass a string. So demo underscore DB. So let's save it, go back to Compass and delete these two posts, and we can even delete the collection. So if I drop this collection, we need to give the name again, drop the collection, and go back to Postman and send another request. So go back to Compass and refresh the databases. We have our DemoDB post again. So even if the database or the table doesn't exist, Mongoose is going to create that for us. But you can see we can successfully write to our database. Now let's do a bit of validation before we actually write to the database. I'm going to make some comments here as we go along. So here we are grabbing the data from request body. Then I want to check if the fields are not empty. So I can just provide an if statement and say if the title is empty or the body is empty, then what do we want to do? We want to return a response. Now I can just copy this and paste it here. So I'm using the return keyword because I don't want anything else to run if the title and the body is empty. So I just want to return a response and not bother with the rest of the code. And the response we want to send is going to be maybe 400. So that is bad request. So if we go to this website, you can see we have 400 as our bad request. So that is kind of a bad request because the user has to fill in these fields. And the message we want to send is actually an error, and we want to say all fields are required. So I'm using this sort of a response because when we go to the front end, we will use these to show to the user what's going on or what's the error. So let's save this one, go to Postman and delete this post 1 as a title. So just an empty string, right? So press send, we get error, all fields are required. So that's our validation. And then if that is okay, then we want to try. So we don't want to just assume everything is going well and write to the database. So we want to try and I want to create a variable here, call it post, set it to this statement. So if this is successful, we will have our data in our database and also this post variable, which I can use it in the response. I'm going to send a 200 response, which means it was okay, and then a success message that says post created. Then alongside with that message, I'm going to send the post itself. So we have it in our response. But if there is an error for whatever reason, I'm going to respond with something else. So I'm going to copy this response, paste it here, set the status to 500, that is a server error, and set the error to error message. So this error message is coming from this error object here. All right, so let's save this one and go back here and press send. We will get all fields are required, but let's create a post here. So I want to say post 2 and press send. We get success, post created, and also the post object itself. And if we check our database, we should have 2 posts now. Later on, when we create our user models and authentication, we will check if the user is authorized to do it. Right now we can't because we don't have a user, but this is our create post route. So I'm going to make some comments here so it's easy to distinguish. All right, so I made this comment so it's easy to understand what's going on here. Let's create another route for getting all the posts out of the database. So I'm just going to copy this line of comment, paste it here, and say get all posts. So this time we want to grab the router and use the get method. Of course, we want to get all the posts. We use the get method, and it's going to happen on the home page. So the path is going to be /. Then again, we need to grab request and response. And this time, we just want to try to get the post if there is any. So we don't have to check for anything. We just have to create a try catch block. And let's create a posts variable and set it to a query from our database. Again, since we are communicating with database, we need to make sure this is async. And we need to await for post model. And this time we want to find something. Now this method finds and returns the documents based on a query. So if we pass something here, like title is hello, it's going to return the post that they have the title set to hello. But we want all the posts, so we can just pass an empty function. So this is going to return all the posts for us. Now, if this is successful, we want to again maybe copy this response code down here, just paste it here, and just return the posts. Maybe we don't even need a message. We just return the posts if they exist. If they don't, we want to maybe respond with the error message. So that's our method here. So let's test it out in Postman. I want to go to this endpoint using the get method. So let's press send. We should get, there we go, an array of objects. So 2 posts. Let's delete our posts, see what happens. So I'm going to delete this one and this one. So let's send the request again. We get an empty array of posts. Now, you can see that our routes file is getting quite long and difficult to distinguish what's what. So what we want to do here, create another folder in our backend folder, and I'm going to call it controllers. If you're familiar with an MVC pattern, this is kind of the same. So anyway, inside the controllers folder, I'm going to create a file, posts controller.js. Now inside this controllers, I will have functions. So let's say we want to have get posts, and the function that is going to run is this right here. So we want to grab this function from the async word all the way to the closing curly brackets. So I'm going to cut it and paste it here. So that's our get post. I'm also going to cut this comment and paste it above the function. Then we need our create post. So let's cut this thing and paste it here and cut this whole function, and then create a add post function and set it to that function, of course. Okay, so let me format the code. We have 2 functions here, and we need to export them, of course. So let's say export, and we want to use an object here because there are multiple functions here. And we want to say get posts and add post. Okay, save this one, go back to posts route. Now we need to import those functions. Let's see if VS Code will auto import that for me. In our get function, we have the path. Now we need a handler. Now our handler is in this file called get posts. So let's say get posts. And VS Code actually does import that for us. Great. Now for this one, we want to say add posts. Fantastic. And you can see up here, they are imported automatically. this is another step of us organizing our code. So you can see this is our router, much cleaner, and these are the handlers for our routes. So I can make some comments here. For example, get all posts route, then copy it, paste it down here, add a new post route. All right, so one thing I forgot to do here is in our post controller, we need to import post object because we are using it and I forgot to import it. So on the very top, I'm going to import post from postmodel.js. Let's test this out. So in our database, we don't have any post. If we go back to Postman and try to make a request on this endpoint with post as our request and press send, we get a success. Post 1 was created. Let's have another one, post 2, and press send, and that was created too. And in our database, we have 2 posts now. Next, we want to see how to delete a post. So what I'm going to do in our post routes, copy this line of code, paste it down here, and change this to delete post route. And the method we are going to use this time is going to be delete. So since we are deleting, so we are going to use a delete request, and the endpoint is going to be dynamic. So we want to go, for example, to /API /post and then the ID of that post. So in order to have dynamic data in our URL, we can use colon and then the name of the property. So I want to have ID, so I can use ID. So later on in our handler, this would be part of the request parameters. So this is a parameter and we can grab it from the request object. Now the method that is going to handle it is going to be delete post. So we just have to import it up here, delete post, and back in our controller, we are going to create that method. So I'm going to copy this line of comment, change this to delete post, create a delete post function. And again, it's going to be async. We need to grab request and response and then handle deleting a post. So let's first export it before we forget and save, and also save this one. So first, I just want to test this out. So I'm going to respond with request params. So we have this property available on the request object that is the parameters included in the URL. And I'm just sending a normal response, not a JSON one. I just want to test this out and see what we get. So if we come back here and change this to delete, because that's the method we said we are going to use right here. And then we said we are going to accept an ID. So let's just add some numbers here and then press send. You can see we get ID. That is the parameter we said we want to call it. And then the actual number. So that is the number. So we can pass anything here, even a string would work. It doesn't really matter. There is no checking at this point. We're just reading whatever is in the URL. Now remember, when we were creating our objects, the ID is not just a number, it's an object ID. So the first step for deleting a post to check if the ID that we are getting is the same as this object ID. So back in our post controller, I just want to check if the ID is a valid type. And since this ID object belongs to Mongoose, we need to import it up here. So VS Code will automatically import that for us. So I'm just going to use an if statement and use Mongoose. So you can see it's auto imported for me. Grab the types, then object ID, then is valid. So these are all part of Mongoose. So we are grabbing Mongoose object and we want to grab the types of the available types of data on Mongoose. And then we want to say if this object ID is valid, so is it a valid object ID like this? And this is a function, so we need to pass whatever we want to check if it's an object ID. In this case, we want to say request params. We already checked that one, and then ID. Remember, the key here is ID. So we want to say, is this ID a valid object ID? If it is not, so we just want to negate it and return maybe a bad request. So I'm going to copy that line of code, just paste it down here. So let's say we want to return a bad request and say error, for example, incorrect ID. Now, this is just in case the user goes into the URL and try to manually change the ID. Or for example, a user is actually using Postman and they try to delete a post. So we want to make sure that the ID that they are inserting manually is a correct ID. Otherwise, in the front end, we will handle all these problems so the user don't even have to worry about the ID being valid or not. So that's it. So let's save this one. and go back to Postman. So this ID, we know it's not valid. So if I press send, we get error incorrect ID. And we don't need to get too technical. What is this object ID and what is valid and what is not valid? But if you are curious, you can check the documentation on object IDs. I already pulled it up, and it says it's a special object that is a 24-character hexadecimal string. Anyway, so that's our first check for deleting a post. Now the next check is to see if the post actually exists. So we want to say check the post exists. So first we need to try to find it. So I'm going to create a variable set it to post and query our database. So we need to await because we are communicating with the database again. So we want to grab our post model and try to find one. Now we can use the find one or find by ID. Since we already have the ID up here, so this is what we want to use. We want to find one through the ID. That is the unique identifier for our posts. So in here, we just want to pass this request params ID again. And if this returns true, that means we found a post. If not, then the post doesn't exist. So let's do another if statement here and say if the post doesn't exist, then return another bad request. This time we want to say post not found. So that is our second step for checking the post exists and then deleting it. So let's try to delete the post. So in this try catch block, we want to delete the post. Now, we already have the access to the post if it exists, right? So if it doesn't exist, we will just return this response and we will not run the rest of this code. But if it exists, it's up here. It's in this post variable. So we can just say await post and then delete one. So we can use this function on a database document just like this. So this is our database document. So if it exists, we want to delete it. So delete one is going to delete this post. And that's it. So when we are done, we are going to return a response. Maybe I'm going to copy that, paste it down here, and send a success message. And the message should read post was deleted. And we don't have a post here. And that's it. That is in case everything goes well. If there was an error, we just want to send another 500 respond and show the error message. That's it. That is for deleting a post. So let's save this one. We need to go to this endpoint. So we need to go to API posts and then a valid ID. So first, let me just send this request with an invalid ID. We get incorrect ID, of course. Now let's go back to our database. We have two posts with these IDs. I'm going to copy post2 ID. So I'm going to copy this string and back to Postman. I'm going to paste it here, but I want to change this. So I'm going to add an S at the end and press send. We get incorrect ID again. Now, this is because the ID is still invalid. Remember, that is going to be a 24-character hexadecimal. So if I change this 8 to 7, it's a valid ID, but it doesn't exist in our database. So if I press send, we get post not found, exactly what we want. So I want to change it back to 8 and press send. We get success post deleted. If we go back to our database, refresh, we have only one. That is deleting a post. And for our last route, let's have updating a post. So I'm going to copy this whole thing for the delete post and change this to update post route. And the request method for this one is going to be put. We could use a patch request too, but it doesn't make a difference in our case because we have only two fields. But basically put will replace the whole object, but patch will just change the properties in place kind of thing. Anyway, we need to go to the same route. So we need an ID and then the method that is going to handle it, I'm going to call it update post. So let's import it up here, update post, and let's go back to post controller and create that function. So again, I'm going to copy this line of comment and paste it down here and change this to update, create our update post, set it to an async function, grab request and response and see what we can do. First, let's export this one. So update post, save it and save our routes too. All right, so let's see what we need to do here. So updating a post is kind of a combination of creating and deleting. So we need to make sure the post exists, but we need also the data from the body of our request. First, we can grab the data from the body, just like what we did in the create post. So these two lines here, I'm going to copy them and paste it down here. So we want to grab the title and the body from the request body because that's what we expect. Then, since we are going to a route with an ID and that ID needs to be valid, we need to check for the ID. So we want to grab this one from the delete method, and you can see we are mixing those two methods into one. We want to make sure that ID in the URL is actually valid. Then we need to check the post exists. Again, I want to copy this and paste it down here. And if the post doesn't exist, we want to return a bad request or maybe 500. These code status, by the way, I'm not really too concerned about them, and you can change them to a code you want. But I just want to send a bad request. So post doesn't exist, and if post does exist, we want to try to update it. So we also need to check if this body and title are not empty. So up here again, we already checking that. So let's copy it and paste it down here. So first we grab the title and the body from the request body. Then we check if they are empty, we return an error. If they are not, we go to the next step. We check for the ID in the URL. Is it valid? And if it is not, we return another error. Then if it is valid, we go to the next step, and that is trying to find our post. And if the post doesn't exist, then we say post not found. But if it does exist, we try to update it. So I want to create another try catch block. And in this try block, I want to try to update that post. So this is kind of like that delete one. So we already have access to this document, and we can use the update one method on it. And this update one method takes the new values that we want to replace. So in this case, we want the new title and the body. And you notice we don't have to say title is going to be title because they have the same name. That's why we don't have to repeat ourselves. So if in our request body, the title name was, I don't know, something else, then we had to specifically say title is going to be text field number 1, for example. But having the same names allows us to just write the name one time. That's all we want to do. We want to update the post and then send this success response. So we want to say post was updated. If it wasn't successful for whatever reason, we want to send a 500 response and show the error message. And that's it. That is our update post method. So let's test this out. Back in our database, we have only one post, right? So that is post 1, and that is the ID. I want to grab this ID. So copy back to Postman. We need to change this to put. Then we need to include the ID. So first, if we have an invalid ID, so I want to just add number 3 here, press send, we get incorrect ID. So I want to change that E to 2, press send, we get post not found. But let's say the ID is correct, but we don't have a title in the request body. So the title is empty. Press send, we get all fields are required, of course. So now let's change this one. So we want to say updated post. All right, so we just changed the title to updated post, and the ID is correct. Press send, we get success. And if we go back to our database and refresh, we get updated post. And that is how we can update our post. So we are 99% done with our posts API. And that 1% remains because of the users API. So when we create our users, we want to come back here and make sure that the user that is trying to perform these tasks is in fact authorized to do them. So for now, we are done with the posts, and we tested out everything and it works the way we want. We want to start creating our users API and then putting them all together at the end. So let's start with the users. All right, so the users API is going to be quite similar to the posts. So we need to follow the same steps. We need to create our endpoint, and then we need to create our model for our database, and then the controller to handle the routes. So let's just start in server.js, and I'm going to duplicate this code here. So instead of saying go to API posts, we want to say go to API users. And the file that is going to handle the routes, we are going to call it users routes. So I'm going to duplicate this line and change these two instances to users routes. So users route from users routes file. Let's create it inside our routes. We want to call it users routes.js. And we kind of need to do the same thing as with our posts routes. And I notice we are still using this import here. We don't need it anymore. And we can just delete this import. So for our users, we just need 2 routes, one to register a user and one to log in. Let's create our router first. So we need to import Express from the Express package, of course, and then create our router and set it to express.router. Now we need to define our route. So I'm going to make comments here and say register user route. So we need to have a post request on the home page of our API, which we specified it to be /API/users. So when we go to that endpoint, we want to create a function, and let's call it register user function, or just register. So we will create these functions in our user's controller, which we don't have it yet. But if we just import it, so we want to import register user from controllers, and we want to call it users controller.js. So we will create this file in a moment. But this is our route for registering a user, and I'm just going to copy it and paste it down here. We want to have a route for login, and it should go to /login. So we cannot have the same method on the same path. So we can say it's going to be a post request on the login page, and let's just call it login user. We don't have to say login user, we can just say login and register, and that should work. And let's export router as users route. Remember, this is the name we used in our server. So users route. So now I can save it, and I can save this one. We are getting an error because this imports don't exist. So let's create users controller inside the controllers folder. So users controller.js. And you notice at this point, we are not actually doing anything. We are just kind of copy pasting from post routes and just changing the name. So we don't have any logic at the moment. We are just preparing the stage, if you will. So we need to create these two methods, login and user. And I just want to grab this line of comment, which I created, and paste it here. So this is going to be register user. So we want to create a register user function, and it's going to be an async function, and we need to accept request and response. And at this point, I just want to send a response that says register. So when we go to this endpoint, we know it's working, and this is our register function. Let's copy the whole thing and log in the user. So we want to just change this name to login and then export these two methods. So export register user and login user. So let's format it, save it. Server is back to normal now, and we can test our route. So let's go to Postman and change this URL to API/users and set the method to post and press send. So we get our register text. This is our register page, and /login. We get register because I just have to change this text. So it is working. It's just the same text. So if we send this again, we get login. So the next step is to create our model. So let's go to models folder, create another file and call it user model.js. So we need to import Mongoose, but VS Code will do that automatically. So I can just create my user schema and set it to a new mongoose.schema and define the fields that I want for my user. For our users, all I want is an email and a password. The email type should be string and it cannot be empty, so it is required, but it also needs to be unique. So we can set the unique to true. So we cannot have two users with the same email. Then a password that is going to be a string again and required. So of course it doesn't have to be unique, this one. Now again, I want the timestamps for my users table 2 or users collection. So we can set the timestamps to true in the second argument as an object. That's all we want for our user schema. Let's now create our user model and set it to mongoose.model. And we need to give it a name. So user with a capital U, and use that user schema for the pattern for the schema. Now let's export the user. That's it. So we are done with our user model. We can just close this file. So we expect an email and a password. Now let's start by registering a new user, basically saving a new user into our database. And it's going to be very much like the post create method. So I'm going to delete this line of code and start by grabbing the email and password from the body. So we expect an email and a password from the request body. So like before, I'm going to make comments here. Grab data from request body. Then we want to check the fields are not empty. So we can add an if statement, and like before, we want to say if email or password are empty using the exclamation marks. We want to return a response with the status code of 400, so bad request again, and send JSON, create an error message, and say all fields are required. Now there are a few more checks we need to do before creating the user, but I just want to test and see if this works. So I want to create a try catch block and create a user variable, set it to await because we are going to communicate with the database. This time we want to grab user object, so we need to import it. Now I can see VS Code doesn't recognize our user, so we need to do it manually. On the very top, I want to say import user from models and user model.js. So on this user object, just like with post, we want to create a new user. So we can use the create method and then pass the email and password. So if this is successful, we want to send a response with the status code of 200 with JSON data that would contain the email that the user provided. So if you get the email in the response, that means the user was successfully created. Now, if it wasn't, if we got an error, we want to set the status to 500 and set the error to that error message. All right, so let's test this out. So we are testing the register. Let's go back to Postman. We have the post method. We have to go to API users and let's send. We get all fields required because the title and the body are not the ones that we are looking for. So we want to change this to email and password. And I want to change the email to john@example.com and the password to 321321. So first, I'm going to cut the password for a second. I'm going to leave it empty and press send. We get all fields are required. I want to paste it. We have an email and password and press send. We get the email, which means we saved this user into our database. So let's go to Compass. And if we refresh our databases here, we should see a users collection. There we go, with that one user. But remember in our model, we said email must be unique. So if I try to send a request again with the same email, we are going to get an error. So you can see we get a duplicate key error. Basically it says email cannot be repeated. And this error message is coming from this catch block. So we want to handle that ourselves before even getting into this try catch block. So I want to create another comment here and say, check if email already exists. So I want to create a variable, call it exist, and set it to await because I want to query our database. And I want to grab the user and find one. So this time, because we are going to use the email as our criteria for finding a document, we use the find one method. And this takes an object for the query. So we want to check the field email for example, john@example.com. So of course, this email string is coming from the request body, which is this one. So again, we can say email is email. And since they have the same name, we can just provide one of them. So we want to say if this email exists in our database, or in other words, if there is a user already registered with this email. If so, we want to return another response. So I want to copy this response here, paste it down here and say if exists, we want to say maybe another 400 or 401, it doesn't matter. And this time we want to say email is already taken. So that is our second check. So let's save this one, go back to Postman, and I'm going to send a request using the same email. We get our custom error message. Email is already taken. Now, the next step is to hash the password because at this point, you can see in our database, the password is saved as plain text. So this is not what we want, of course. We want to hash the password and then save it into database. And then when the user logs in, then decrypt it or decode it. And then if that matches, they can log in. So for that, we are going to use bcrypt. And remember, we installed this in the beginning. So I want to import bcrypt from a BcryptJS package. I call it bcrypt, but we can call it whatever we want. And this package takes something called a salt to generate a hash password. And that salt is basically a random generated string that is going to be mixed with this plain password and generate something new. I'm going to make a comment here and say hash the password. So we want to create a salt variable, and the name salt is just a convention from bcrypt. And we want to use the await keyword because the function we are going to use is going to return the promise. We can grab the bcrypt, which we imported up here, and then use gen salt function on this. And this function can take a number, and the higher the number is, the longer our salt string would be. And of course, it's going to take more time to generate that number for us. And you can see it returns a promise of type string. So By default, the number is 10, and I'm going to leave it at default. So that is our salt. Now we need to create another variable. I'm going to call it hashed or hashed password. And again, we are going to use bcrypt.hash. So this function also returns a promise, and it takes two arguments. The first one is the string of password. So this plain password we are getting from the user. And the second argument is the salt. We are already generating the salt up here, so we can just pass it down there. This method is going to take these two arguments and put them together and generate a unique hash password that later on can decode and compare with the plain text. So down here, when we create our user, instead of saying the password is going to be this password, we want to say the password field in our database is going to be this hashed variable up here. Email is the same, but the password is going to be this one. All right, so let's save this one, go back to Postman. And if we try to create another user, maybe Mike, with the same password, so 321321, and press send, we get the email. That means it was successful. And if we check the database, we see Mike, and the password is this random string. So we are successfully hashing the password and saving it into our database, and that is registering a user. We will come back to this when we want to create that specific signature for authorization. But for now, this is our register function. Let's do the login next. So the login function is going to be quite similar to the register. First, we want to grab the email and password from the request body, then check if they are not empty, and then check if the user exists, and then try to log in. So I'm going to grab these three blocks. So copy these, paste it inside the login method. So first we grab the email and password from request body. Then we check that those fields are not empty. Then this time, instead of creating an exist variable, I want to create the user variable. So this time I want to do the opposite way. So we want to say if the user exists, we actually want to use it later. But if it doesn't, so we can say if user doesn't exist, it's perhaps the email is not correct. So we can say incorrect email, right? So if we don't find any user with this email that the user provides, we just want to say that's an incorrect email. Now the next part, we want to check if the password matches. So we want to see if the user is providing the right password. So let's create another comment and say check password. So this time I'm going to create a matched or match variable and use that bcrypt again to compare the passwords from our database and this password that the user provides. So again, we need to use await keyword because this function also returns a promise. So we want to use the bcrypt, and the function we want is compare. And this method or function takes two arguments. The first one is the password, the plain password that the user provides. The second one is the hashed password. So we can grab the hashed password from this user. So we can say user.password, because by this time we've checked and we found the user. If we don't, we are going to return this. But if we find the user, we want to come down here and check if the password matches. Let's do another if statement and say if it doesn't match, then again, send another bad request response and say incorrect password. If every check passes, we want to just send a success response, because we don't actually need to do anything with the database. We just want to say, okay, all of these was correct and you are logged in. So in this case, I just want to send a response with the user's email. And if there was an error, we can just copy that code and paste it here. So just send a response with the error. And that's it for our login. Let's test this out. So I want to go to Postman, go to /login. The method is post. So we have three checks and we want to see if all of them work. First of all, I'm going to delete this password and press send. We get all fields are required, of course. So let's do 321321 and let's change the email to Mike2. We know we don't have this in our database. We have only John and Mike. So if I press send, we get incorrect email. Let's put it back to Mike and change the password to something that is not correct. So let's press send. We get incorrect password this time. So that is working too. Now let's say everything is correct. Mike@example.com and the password is correct. Press send. We get the email, meaning it was all correct. So that is our login and register, and most of the work for our users API. The last part we want to do for our users API to add that authentication signature so we can use it somewhere else. So let's do that now. So I'm going to copy this line of comment and right on the very top of the user controller, I'm going to create a function. This is going to be creating JWT token or JSON Web Token. This T is actually token, but it doesn't matter. So before we create our function, let's go to JsonWebToken website. So I pulled it up already. It's right here. So they don't have a documentation on their website. At least I couldn't find any, but they do have a free ebook and you can download it and read all about it. But basically we have this string, which is a unique string and it's random and it consists of three parts. The red part, which is the algorithm and the type, the purple part, which is the payload, the data that we send. For example, we can include the name, the ID or something like that. Then we have the blue part, which is the signature. So this is a signature that JWT uses to verify the authenticity of this signature. And for that, we need a secret phrase. So this secret phrase will be only available for us as developers. We could just create it here in this file because we are just developing and we are not really deploying this anywhere. But let's say but in a real application, you would make an env file. So in the backend folder, I'm going to create a .env file that would be our environment variables. At this point, we don't have any, but let's create our secret phrase here. So I want to create a variable, call it secret, and by convention, they are all caps. And let's just create something. I want to say my secret phrase with an exclamation. So just a string, but the longer and the more complicated this is, the stronger it gets. So, but for this example, I'm just going to use this one. Now, in order to access this, we will use that package.env, which we used already. So let's go back to the controller and import .env /config. So we don't have to create an instance of this. We can just import it like this and then use it. Let's create a function here. I'm going to call it create token. And we are going to accept an ID. Now, in order to create a JSON Web Token, you need to import it first. So let's import JWT. I'm going to call it JWT from a JSON Web Token. And inside this function, we want to return a JSON Web Token .sign. So this sign function takes three arguments. The first one is a payload, which can be an object or a string. We can pass an object, and that is going to be our ID. Remember, this payload is going to consist of the data we want to use for our signature, and then we can grab it when we decode it. So we want to send the ID as the unique identifier for our users. The second argument is going to be the secret private key. Now, we already created that inside our environment file. To access that, we can use process.env and then the name of that variable. So I called it secret. And the third one is the options. So we can pass options and say how long, for example, this token will be valid. So we can pass expires in, let's say, 10 days. So 10D or 30 days. So after 10 days, if the user doesn't renew the token, it's going to expire. It's no good. Now, when we register a user or logging them in, we want to create a unique token for them so that we can use it for authentication purposes when they want to do certain tasks like creating a post or deleting a post and so on. All right, so let's go back to register. And when we create our user here, we want to also create a token or generate a token. So we can create a token variable and set it to create token. So the function that we specified up there. And this is expecting an ID, right? So we can just pass user underscore ID. We are using underscore here because our users objects, they have this property underscore ID. We could come up here and change this to underscore ID, so it would be the same as the ID property in our database. So let me add some comments here. So that is registering the user, and that is creating the JSON Web Token, and this is sending the response. Now, when we send the response, we want to send the email and the token. So we actually need this token in the front end for authentication. So we want to do the same thing when the user logs in. So I'm just going to copy this line with the comment, and in this try catch block, I'm going to create the JSON web token first, and we already have access to the user up here. And just like what we did with the register, we are going to send the token alongside with the email in the success response. Let's test this out. For example, this Mike guy wants to log in. So let's press send. We log in and we have this token. And let's grab this token. I'm going to copy the whole thing and go to JsonWebToken website and paste it here. So you can see in our payload, we have the ID, and this is an ID that ends with AD7. So if we check our database, we have Mike ID as AD7. So we can use this token for authorization, and we would be able to extract the ID using the same JSON Web Token package and use it for authorized purposes. So that's it for our users API. And we don't have to do anything here with the users anymore. We do have to go back to Posts API to add authorization for certain tasks. So that would be our next job. All right, so the first step is to link our collections in the database. So we have our posts collection and then the users, and we want to say that a post belongs to a user. So we need a new field here that specifies a user. Let's start with our models. So using Mongoose, we can reference collections within one another. And I want to have a user field for my posts. So let me add the comma here. First, we need to set the type to Mongoose, then schema, then types, then object ID. So what we want is the user's ID, and that ID again is not just any string, it's a special object ID from Mongoose. Now we could name this user ID or just ID. I think user is fine too. So this field is also required because if there is no user, they cannot just create a post. There has to be a user. And then we need a reference. So we can use the ref property and say, what is the related collection? So this object ID, where is it coming from? And we can grab the user. So we are in the post schema, right? And in our user schema, we called this one a user. So we want to say, grab that user, and we want the object ID. So let's save this one. And if we try to create a new post now, let's go back to our Postman and change this to posts and get rid of the login, and let's add some title and body. We don't really need to change this, doesn't matter. I just want to test this out. So if I try to make a request here and press send, we get an error that says post validation failed, user is required, because we are not handling the user error in our post controller. So this is the default error that we catch it using our try catch. Now we're supposed to fill the user's ID using that authentication system we put in place. So in our user controller, when the user register or log in, they get a token, remember? And that token has the payload in which we have the ID of the user. Now all we have to do is to create a way to have that token in the headers and then extract the ID and add it to our post create or delete or update. So to the routes that need that ID. And for that, we can use a middleware. So I'm going to close all these windows so we can start clean. So remember, this was the first middleware we used. And if we go back to Express documentation under middlewares. So you can see we have here middleware functions can perform the following tasks: execute any code, make changes to request and responses object, end the request response cycle, and call the next middleware function. So with a middleware, we have access to request, to response, and to a next method. This next method triggers the next middleware. If we don't provide this one, the code will stop here. So we want to create our own middleware. So we can go to writing middlewares. And there's a nice chart here that says what we can do. We can just specify the method and then the path, the function, and we have access to request, response, and next. So don't worry about all of this right now. As we create our middleware, we can see it in practice and how it looks like. So let's just go to the project. I'm going to create a folder and call it middlewares. We have only one, but I just want to be organized. And inside the middlewares, I'm going to create an auth.js. So remember, I also mentioned that middlewares are kind of like checkpoints. So for example, in our posts routes, when we go to creating a new post, we go to this path and we handle it using function. Now we need some checkpoint in the middle right here. So if the path is our client, handler is our response, then we need a middleware. We need a checkpoint here. The same thing goes for delete and put. So we can create our middleware now and add it to these routes. Now this middleware would be in charge of reading the token and extracting the ID from it, and then check if that user is authorized or this ID is valid. So we are going to use the JWT again. So let's import it first. Import JWT from JsonWebToken. We are also going to work with users because we are going to use the user's ID. So we want to say import user from models. So we need to go out one folder and then user model.js. Now we are going to create our middleware, and I'm going to call it auth. So remember in Express documentation, we see that we can grab request, response, and next. So let's do that. We want to grab request, response, and next function. Inside this function, the first thing we want to do, we need to grab the token from somewhere. Now, one common way for authorization in many websites is to have an authorization key in your header. So for example, here, when you request something, you can add another key and it's called authorization, and then we can use that token here. So what we want to do here, when we send a request, for example, to create a post, we want to send the token that belongs to a user alongside with that. So our backend server can check. Now the authentication token starts with bearer string and then the token. So we have bearer space, then the token. So that is how we send authorization keys to the server. So that's one way you can do that, add it manually, or you can go to the authorization tab and choose the bearer token here and then add the token right here. So we will come back to this. We are not ready for this yet. So that's what we expect, and we want to extract this in this middleware. So we want to first say if there is a key in our headers called authorization. So we want to grab the authorization from the header. So we can just say grab it from the headers. So the request headers, of course, would consist of these key value pairs, and we want the authorization. So first we want to check if this authorization key exists at all. If it doesn't exist, we would probably want to send a response with the status code of 401, and 401 is not authorized, unauthorized. Then we want to send JSON, and the error that we want to include, that is going to be authorization token not found. Okay, so that's the first step. If it does exist, we want to grab the token out of that bearer string. So remember, the authorization token would go like this: bearer and then a space and then the token. So we need to extract the token from that authorization string. So I'm going to make comment here again. So we want to grab the token and take the bearer space away. So we can create a token variable here and set it to authorization.split. This is a JavaScript function, of course, and it's going to split a string based on a substring that we pass here, or as a separator, and we want to separate it based on a space. So I'm just including a space here, and this will give me an array. So we have bearer space the string, and that string doesn't have any spaces. So we would have an array with two elements. One is going to be bearer at the index of 0, and at the index of 1, we will have our token. So we can just pass index 1 using the brackets. So this will give us that token. Now, what do we want to do here? We want to try to decode it. So let's add a try catch block, and again, I'm going to make comments. So we want to decode and extract the user ID from the token. Now, let's create our ID first. I'm using this syntax here because remember, when we send that token in the payload, so back in JWT website, in the payload, the key is underscore ID, and it's an object. So we want to destructure it and use the same name. So underscore ID, and set it to jwt.verify. So the verify function takes two arguments. The first one is the token. Now we've already extracted that one, so we can just say token. And the second one is the secret code that we used to generate the token. And remember, that one is our in env. So this is our secret token that nobody knows except ourselves. So we want to just, again, use process.env and then the name of the variable. Now this function would check if this token was signed with the same secret ID, so they have their own method algorithm, and if that's correct, then it will give us the ID. Otherwise, we would get an error. Now, if that works properly, we want to save the user in request body. So remember, this is a checkpoint. So this happens before we actually handle a request. So when the user goes to create a post, and this function kicks in and checks if the authorization token exists, then we will create another property in our request so it would be the user. And then when the API looks at the request, there will be a user already saved in there. So we will see this in action just in a moment. So we want to grab the request and create a user property in there and set it to the ID that we find from our database, because we want to make sure this user exists in our database, right? We don't want to just use this ID, and that's why we imported user. And since we are going to query our database, we need to change this to async, and down here we want to say await user dot find by ID. Then we can pass the ID. Now if this is true, it's going to give us a user. We can chain another method to this query and say what do we want from the object that we get. If we just return that one, we would get email, password, ID, and all these fields. All we want actually is the ID, so we can just say select and then pass the name of that field that we want. So this would create a user in the request that has only the ID. Again, we could just use this ID because technically this token is generated using a user ID. That means the user already existed, and then we created the token. And this is just an extra step to make sure that this ID is not tampered with, or we actually have this ID extracted from JsonWebToken exists in our database. Now, when everything goes well here, we want to say go to the next middleware. If we don't include this one, it's going to stop here. It's going to just do all of this and then stop and not go anywhere. But we actually want to go to handler, and we just want to add, if there is an error, we want to send the response with the status code of 401, again not authorized, and send JSON with the error message. All right, so let's export this and use it, and then we will come back here to recap. So export default auth. So that is our way of authorization. So this is our middleware. Let's go to posts routes. So that's where we want to check for authorization. We don't need to authorize when we get all the posts. So everybody can see the posts even if they're not registered, but they cannot create a post if they are not authorized. So we want to use the authorization for this route as a middleware, so as a checkpoint. So with these methods, we can also pass the middleware. So the first one is the path. Then we can have the middleware. We called it auth. So VS Code automatically imported that for me. And then the handler. So when we go to this route and request something, this auth comes in and says, okay, let me check first. Do you have an authorization in your header? If you do, does it provide the bearer token? And if it does, then I'm going to extract it and make sure everything is fine, and then I'm going to go to the next. So that next will trigger this handler. So let's see how this works. So let's go to Postman, and right now we don't have any authorization in our header. And in here, I'm going to put it back to no auth. So in the body, let's actually try to create a post blog, and the text should read, this is the new post. Now we have our validation for our posts, right? So if this post was empty, I would expect to get all fields required, like down here. But if I press send, we get authorization token not found, because this happens before we get to this handler where we check and validate the data. So the first thing we are looking for is the authorization key. So we can log in first using a user, then use that token for creating a post. So let's create a new tab here because I don't want to lose this one, and go to localhost port 4000 API users. We want to log in, so /login. The method should be post, the body should be raw JSON, and we want to include email and password. For example, I want to use this mic, so I'm just going to copy the email, and I know the password is 321321. So back here, email is that one, the password is 321321. So let's sign in, we press send, we get our token. Now we can use this for creating a post. So what we need to do here, again, we can either add the authorization here or using this tab. So we want to choose bearer token, then grab this token when the user login, then come back to our post tab, then paste the token here. And I'm not pressing send yet, but if we check our headers, you can see now we have authorization added here. And we have that string bearer, then a space, and then our token. So now we have the token and we have the post body, but the title is empty. Let's press send. We get all fields required, meaning that authorization is actually passed. But if I go back here and try to change this token, so the last character is C, I just want to change it to X and press send again, we get invalid signature. So this is a way to see if the user is actually authorized. So we want to put it back to C, press send again, we get all fields required, and let's provide a title here. So for example, post blog, and try to send this, press send. So we get another error. But we know it's not the authorization error, and it's not because of the field. It says because the user doesn't exist and it is required. So we haven't handled the user property, the user field in our post controller yet. So we have to go back there and where we are creating a post right here. So what I want to do here before doing anything, comment everything out and send a JSON response with request user. I want to see if this exists. So remember in our auth middleware, we said we want to create a user property and set it to the user if we find one. So let's go back here and press send. We get the ID set to AD7, and that is the ID for this mic guy. So we know it's working, and all we have to do here in our post controller, we need to just add that user to this object when we create our post. So I'm going to get rid of this, and after we check the fields are not empty, so I want to grab the authenticated user from request body. So let's create a user variable and set it to await. And since we are going to query the user collection, we need to import it. So if I just type user here, I believe, yes, VS Code imports that for us. So await user and find by ID, and we want to just find using the request user ID. So again, this gives us an object where the key is underscore ID and then the actual ID as the value. So that's what we pass here. Since we only expect the ID down here, we could either say select the ID, or down here we can just say user. It's going to be user dot underscore ID. So this will do the same thing. Now this is kind of preference, and you can go back to the post model and change this to user IDs. So it is clear that you are expecting an ID, not a full user. All right. So I'm just going to move this in front. So that's all we have to do. So let's format this code, save it, go back to Postman, try to send this request again. So we have the authorization already, we have the body. Let's just press send. We get success, post created. Now our posts have a new property, and that is user. So this user ID correspond with the user ID that created the post. So now we know Mike created this post right here. So that is one route that we check for authorization before doing anything. We need to do the same thing for delete and update. So I'm just going to add that auth middleware to both of these routes. So that means I cannot delete if the user is not authorized. I cannot update if they are not authorized. Okay, so back in post controller and in the delete method, we want to grab the user out of the request body again. So I'm going to copy this line here, and after we check the post exists, we want to paste that one. Now I'm going to make a comment here and say check the user owns the post. So not only the user exists, but I want to see if this user is actually the owner of the particular post we want to delete. So we can use an if statement here and say if post.user is equal to, so this is a function from Mongoose. So we want to say, is it equal to user dot underscore ID? So this is the particular post the user is going to delete. And this post has a user property, right? And the value for that user is an object ID. It's not just a string ID, it's an object ID. That's why we are using this equal. That this function from Mongoose already knows that we want to check a specific object. And we just want to say, is the post user is equal to this user ID. So that means is this ID is the same as this ID right here. And if it is not, so we just want to negate it, then return a response. So again, maybe this one. This time I want to return the 401 and say you don't own the post, for example, or just say not authorized. So the user, whoever is logged in, is not authorized to delete this post. And if it is correct, then we try to delete the post. So that's the only check we need to do before deleting a post. We just want to do the same thing for update. So I'm going to copy this. So I just realized I'm in the update method, which is okay because we just have to copy this whole thing and paste it for the delete post method. It is exactly the same. We just want to check if the user is authorized and own that particular post. Okay, so let's try to delete a post. So back in our database, we have two users, and maybe let's delete this one and create a proper user with a hashed password. So we have one user, we have two posts. This one doesn't have the user property, so we want to delete this one. And we have a post that Mike created it. So let's go back to Postman and to this tab here where we handle the users. And I'm going to create one instead of logging in. So this guy, for example, John, with the same password. So if I press send here, we get, of course, a new user. And in our database, now we have John with this hashed password. But what I want to do, I want to log in with this John, which technically we are already because we have the token. When we register, we also log in automatically. And I want to grab the token here, copy it, and go back to the Post API. And for the authorization, I'm going to change this token to the token where we get from John user. So if I try to delete this post, I should get an error. Let's copy the ID for the post because we need it for deleting. And we need to change the method to delete and then provide the ID in the URL. Let's press send and see what happens. So of course we get not authorized. That means John doesn't own this post. But let's log in with Mike. So I'm just going to change this to Mike and go to /login and press send. So we get a new authorization key or token and copy this back to Post API, change the authorization header, change the token to the new token, and press send. We get post deleted because of course this was authorized. And if we check our database, the post is gone. So all of this is happening because of this auth middleware. So let's just try to update a post too. First, I'm going to create a post. Let's just get rid of the ID. So we want to create this post. Press send. Okay, post created. Back in database, we have a post created by this user, AD7, that is Mike, this one. Let's log in with John user, press send, and grab the token back to the Post API, paste it here, and then try to update the post. So we want to change this to put, and in the body, we need the title and the body, right? We need also the ID for the new post. So let's go back to the database. In the posts, we have the ID up here. I'm just going to copy it, paste the post ID up here, and change this title to updated and press send. Of course, we get not authorized because this is Mike's post, but John is trying to update it. So let's log in with Mike, press send, and copy the token, go back to API and change this authorization token and press send. We get post was updated. And if we check our database, go to post, we get updated post. All right, so we are almost completely done with our API, with our backend. And I just want to add one more route for the posts, and that is going to be the user's post. So a user specific post. I just want to copy paste this get all post method, change the name to get user posts. And what we need to do here, again, we need to grab the user that we saved it in the request using our auth middleware. So down here in the create new post, we have this statement. I'm just going to copy it and paste it up here. So we need the user. We grab it from the request if it exists. Then we want to try to grab the posts that belong to that user. So I want to change this name to user posts and query post collection and say find not all the posts this time. Remember, using the find function without any argument gives us all the posts. But this time I want to check for a criteria. We have this user property on our posts, right? So we want to say if the user has the same ID as user ID up here. So we grab the user from the request and that has a specific ID, and we want to grab the posts that have the same ID as this user ID. Then if that's correct, we just want to return the user's post. The rest is the same. So this is quite similar to getting the post. We're just saying that not all the posts. Let's export this one down here. So right after get posts, I want to say get user posts, then go back to posts routes, and I want to import it, get user posts, and create a route for it, maybe right under getting all the posts. So this is going to be a get method. Of course, we are getting things, but we want to go to /user, for example, and this route needs to be authorized too, because we want to make this specific for the logged in user. And we are using that middleware in our function up here to grab the user. So we do need to use the middleware here and then get the posts. But this should be get user posts. Let's save this one. Go back to database. So we have one post that Mike created. So let's create another one. So I want to go to the post API, change this to post, get rid of this ID. The authentication is the same. I believe we logged in with Mike. Yes. So the authentication is the same. We just have to check the body, maybe change this to post blog 2 and press send and go back to database. So we have two posts and the ID for the user is the same. So let's grab Mike's post in our post API. So we want to change this to get, and we want to go to /user and just press send. Now this would work because we have the authorization token in the headers. If I press send, we get two posts. If the bearer token for some reason doesn't exist, for example, let's change it. So 8 to 9 and press send, we get invalid signature. Or if it doesn't exist at all, I can just press send, we get authorization token not found. So this is going to be like a user dashboard where they can delete or update their posts easily. So that was the last touch I wanted to add for the posts API. And we are done with our backend. Now I understand this was kind of too much. We went back and forth, and I just wanted to focus on creating the app rather than getting too much into details. So in the next video, we will build our front end using React and Tailwind and communicate with this API we just built. So stay tuned for the next video, and I just want to thank you all for your likes, views, share, subscribe, and all your support. See you all at the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.